Most people think D-Day was won by courage alone. They picture soldiers charging up that beach, bullets flying everywhere, just pure raw guts against impossible odds. But that's not what actually made it work. The real reason D-Day didn't turn into a total massacre came down to one man who never fired a shot in combat. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the way he got there is way crazier than you'd expect. Here's what makes this story so interesting. Eisenhower wasn't born into anything. He had no connections. His family had no money. He wasn't the smartest kid in his class. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't blessed with some special talent that made everyone notice him. And yet, this completely ordinary guy from Kansas ended up making decisions that determined the fate of millions of people. By the time you finish watching this, you're going to see how a nobody became somebody that changed history. Imagine growing up poor, really poor. Your dad works at a creamery making next to nothing. Your mom stretches every dollar just to put food on the table. You've got 5 brothers fighting for the same resources. That was Dwight Eisenhower's childhood in the 1890s. The Eisenhower family moved around constantly chasing work that barely paid enough to survive. When they finally settled in Abilene, Kansas, young Dwight had to work just to help keep the family going. He did whatever jobs he could find. He wasn't thinking about becoming a great leader. He was just a kid trying to help his family not starve. School wasn't some inspiring journey for Dwight either. He wasn't the kid teachers talked about. He wasn't the one getting all A's and winning awards. He was just average. Good enough, but nothing special. His grades were decent. He liked sports. But there was nothing about young Dwight that screamed future military genius. If you had looked at his class at Abilene High School and tried to pick the kid who would one day command millions of soldiers, you would have been wrong if you picked Dwight. When he got to West Point Military Academy, things didn't suddenly click into place. This wasn't some inspirational movie moment where the struggling kid finally finds his calling and becomes amazing. Nope. Eisenhower actually struggled at West Point. His grades were middling at best. He got in trouble for breaking rules. Some of his instructors thought he was lazy. Others didn't think he took things seriously enough. One of his chemistry professors actually said he'd never amount to anything. When Eisenhower graduated in 1915, he ranked 61st out of 164 cadets, right in the middle. Nobody looked at that class and thought Dwight Eisenhower was going to become a legend. After West Point, Eisenhower started his Army career like any other junior officer. He got stationed at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, where he met a woman named Mamie Dowd at a dance. She was from a wealthy family. Her parents were rich. And somehow, this poor kid from Kansas managed to marry into money. They got married in 1916 and started their life together. Mamie would be by his side for everything that came next, but she had no idea what was waiting. For the next 25 years, Eisenhower did the same thing as thousands of other Army officers. He moved from base to base. He trained soldiers. He studied military strategy. He got promoted slowly, very slowly actually. He spent most of his career as a major, stuck in that rank for years while other officers around him climbed faster. During World War I, he wasn't even at the front. He stayed back at Camp Meade in Maryland training new troops. After the war ended, his career basically flatlined. He wasn't getting the promotions he wanted. He wasn't getting the important assignments. He was teaching at the Army War College, doing paperwork, working with recruiters. Just routine stuff. By 1938, Eisenhower was wondering if he'd made a huge mistake joining the Army. He was stuck. He felt like he wasn't going anywhere. He actually considered leaving the military and getting a regular job in civilian life. He had a wife and 2 sons to think about. Maybe the Army life wasn't going to work out for him. Maybe he'd just be another officer nobody remembered. Maybe this was it. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Everything changed in a single day. When the Japanese attacked, the entire country went into shock. Eisenhower was in the Philippines when it happened, stationed there as a staff officer. He watched the chaos unfold. He saw what American forces were up against. After the attack, he got orders to come back to Washington and work at the War Department. His job was to help figure out America's strategy for this massive new war. Washington in early 1942 was absolute chaos. The military had to expand from a few 100,000 soldiers to millions. They had to figure out how to fight enemies on two sides of the world. They had to work with the British, who had their own ideas about how to win. They had to create an entirely new military machine from scratch. It was overwhelming. Eisenhower was just one officer among many, working at a desk in the War Department, trying to make sense of impossible problems. But someone noticed his work. A man named General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, started paying attention to this quiet officer from Kansas who never made a big fuss but somehow made everything around him clearer and more organized. Marshall was the most powerful military figure in America at that time. What Marshall said went. Nobody questioned him, and Marshall saw something in Eisenhower that other people missed. It wasn't that Eisenhower was the smartest guy in the room. It wasn't that he had the most battle experience. It was something else. It was that he could take chaos and turn it into order. He could take conflicting ideas and find a path forward. He could work with different people without letting his ego get in the way. Most importantly, he didn't panic under pressure. Marshall started giving Eisenhower bigger jobs, more responsibility, harder problems to solve, and Eisenhower kept delivering. He kept proving that he could handle it. In 1942, Marshall made the decision that would change everything. He promoted Eisenhower to general and gave him command of all American forces in the European theater. This wasn't a small thing. This meant Eisenhower was now in charge of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers. But here's where the story gets really intense. Being in charge of American soldiers was one thing, but Eisenhower had to work with the British. The British had their own generals with their own ideas about how to win the war. They didn't answer to Eisenhower. They had their own chain of command. The British and American militaries had different strategies, different tactics, different ways of doing things. Getting them to work together was like herding cats. Then there were the French forces, and the Canadian forces, and forces from other allied nations. Everyone wanted a say in how the war was fought. Everyone thought their way was best. Eisenhower had to somehow take all these different militaries from all these different countries and get them to work as one unified force. One mistake, one wrong decision about how to coordinate them, and thousands of people would die for nothing. The pressure was unreal. Eisenhower was living in a foreign country, managing millions of soldiers from different nations, dealing with generals who had decades more experience than him, and trying to figure out how to invade Nazi-controlled Europe. He wasn't sleeping much. He was smoking constantly. The stress was eating him alive, but nobody could see it. On the outside, he looked calm. He looked in control. That was his superpower, actually. He could be falling apart inside, but keep his face steady. Then in late 1943, it happened. Eisenhower got the assignment of his lifetime. He was chosen to plan and execute Operation Overlord. For those who don't know, Operation Overlord was the code name for the D-Day invasion, the biggest military invasion in the entire history of humanity. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, tanks, planes, artillery. Everything America and Britain had been building toward for years was going to come down to one day on a beach in Normandy, France. And Eisenhower had to make it work. Think about this for a second. This wasn't a video game. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. Every decision Eisenhower made could mean life or death for tens of thousands of young men. Some of these soldiers were only 18 or 19 years old. They'd never been in combat before. They were scared. And Eisenhower had to send them into one of the most brutal situations imaginable. He had to look these young men in the eye, knowing that some of them weren't coming back. The planning for D-Day took months. Eisenhower and his staff had to figure out where to land, when to land, how many troops to send, what equipment to bring, how to coordinate with the Navy, how to coordinate with the Air Force, how to coordinate with the British, how to keep it all secret so the Germans didn't find out. Every single detail mattered. One mistake could turn the whole thing into a disaster. Eisenhower spent countless hours studying maps, looking at aerial photographs, reading intelligence reports. He had to memorize the terrain. He had to understand the tides. He had to know the weather patterns. He had to work with meteorologists to figure out the best day to attack. The invasion had to happen during a specific window when the tides and moon phases lined up just right. If they missed that window, they'd have to wait weeks, and there was only so long they could keep the invasion secret. The date was set for June 5, 1944. Hundreds of thousands of troops were staged and ready. Ships were loaded, planes were fueled, everything was in motion. And then, the night before the invasion, Eisenhower got bad weather reports. A storm was coming, heavy wind, rain, rough seas. It was the worst possible timing. Eisenhower had to make a decision that night, and this decision would change the course of human history. He could delay the invasion and wait for better weather. If he delayed, they'd have to reschedule, and keeping it secret would get harder. The Germans might figure out what was coming, or he could go ahead with the invasion despite the bad weather. Eisenhower sat in a small room with his weather expert and some of his top commanders. The tension was unbearable. This one man's decision would determine whether thousands of soldiers lived or died. This one man's decision would determine whether the invasion succeeded or became a bloodbath that would be remembered as one of the biggest military disasters in history. Eisenhower listened to all the information. He asked questions. He thought about it. He didn't rush. And then he made the call. He decided to go ahead with the invasion. He gave the order. The largest invasion fleet in human history began moving toward Normandy on the night of June 5, 1944. What happened next was brutal. The soldiers landed on beaches that turned into hellscapes. Machine gun fire tore through them. Artillery exploded all around them. Young men, many of them just teenagers, were dying by the thousands. The beach was so covered in bodies that later soldiers had to walk over their friends just to move forward. But here's the thing that matters. Because of Eisenhower's planning, his coordination, his strategy, the invasion worked. It was brutal and bloody and tragic, but it worked. The Allies got a foothold in Europe. They had a chance to push back against Nazi Germany, and from that foothold, everything changed. The war started turning, and eventually Germany was defeated. Eisenhower's decision on that night in June 1944 was one of the most important decisions any human has ever made. One decision, one moment, and it changed the course of World War II. It changed the course of the entire 20th century. It saved millions of lives, even though it cost thousands in the short term. After D-Day, Eisenhower's role kept growing. He was now the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe. He was basically the most powerful military leader in the world. He had to coordinate strategy across multiple countries, multiple armies, multiple fronts. He had to manage generals with massive egos. He had to make decisions about where to attack next, how to push Germany back, when to move forward, when to hold ground. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. World War II in Europe was over, and Eisenhower was the face of the victory. The quiet kid from Kansas who nobody thought would amount to anything had just won the biggest war in human history. But here's the crazy part of the story. Eisenhower didn't become power-hungry. He didn't try to stay in charge forever. He didn't use his fame and power to take over the country or anything like that. He actually went back to being humble and relatively quiet. He went home. He wrote his memoirs. He did speaking engagements. He was offered all kinds of jobs and positions. And then years later, in 1952, the American people asked him to run for president. They wanted this famous war hero to lead the country, and he said yes. He was elected president in 1952, and he served as president for 8 years. He wasn't the most exciting president. He wasn't the most flashy, but he was steady. He was calm under pressure. He was good at bringing people together, and Americans appreciated that after years of chaos and war. Eisenhower died in 1969, but his legacy lived on. The interstate highway system in America is officially called the Dwight D. Eisenhower Interstate Highway System because he pushed for it as president. His presidency is remembered as a stable, peaceful time. His military leadership is studied in every military academy in the world. And it all started with a poor kid from Kansas who was told he'd never amount to anything. A kid whose chemistry professor said he'd never make it. A kid who was stuck as a major for years while other officers passed him by. A kid who nobody noticed until George Marshall saw something special in him. The lesson here is that you never really know who's going to change the world. You never know who's going to rise up and do something extraordinary. Sometimes it's the person you'd least expect. Sometimes it's the quiet one. Sometimes it's the average student who just keeps showing up and doing their best. Sometimes it's someone with no natural advantages, no special talents, no obvious path to greatness. Eisenhower didn't become great because he was born great. He became great because he worked hard, he stayed calm under pressure, he listened to other people, and he was willing to make the hard decisions when it mattered. He became great because when his moment came, he was ready. Subscribe to see more stories like this from World War II history.